time. So I want to welcome everyone to our 302nd University of Best Practices or Right Care gathering since 2008. And I want to especially welcome our very first Right Care Leadership Award winner, Jerry Penso, who's now the Chief Executive Officer of the American Medical Group Association, but he helped us to co-found our original Right Care University of Best Practices in San Diego in 2011, before he left for the American Medical Group Association now a decade ago. So with that, I would like to say we've made a lot of progress since you left us, in good shape, Jerry, with a wonderful model to work from in focusing on LDL control, blood pressure control, blood sugar today, or blood sugar control. And today we'll learn much more and great intensity about how to control blood pressure, which is foundational for all of our work. I want to stop to thank our many wonderful collaborators and sponsors and say that we have, among our leadership, we have participation from not only across the state of California, to mention a few, the Capital Region, Don Hufford, Jim Duddle from San Diego, Mike Cantor, Los Angeles, Keith Emmons, Santa Barbara, Cindy Jambroni, Orange County, Bill Bomber, he's either in Lake Tahoe or Sacramento, Joe Sky, I don't remember the name of your county, I think it's Solano County, Joe Sky's with Travis Air Force Base, the wonderful Katrina Taylor, who oversees chronic disease epidemiology and scientists for the state of California. And of course, the Chief Medical Information Officer from Winchester, Virginia, John Cuddeback, and our wonderful co-founder, Jerry Penso. So I will thank our sponsors as well from the biopharmaceutical industry, UC Berkeley, our mothership, the California Department of Public Health, Los Angeles Department of Public Health, Blue Shield, and the Stroke Awareness Foundation, the California chapter of the American College of Cardiology, Stroke Awareness Foundation, Health Trust, etc. We have wonderful supporters from around the state of California and beyond. I'd like to ask everyone to do their CME link earlier today. Please complete that by 4 o'clock. And with that, I'd just like to say that one of our most devoted members of our leadership team, who has been with us since 2008, Dr. Cindy Jambroni of Memorial Care, will be giving the formal introduction of our co-founder, Jerry Penso. Thank you, Cindy, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Hattie. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jerry Penso, who serves as the President and Chief Executive Officer at AMGA. If you're not aware, AMGA is a trade association that represents medical groups and other organized systems of care, including some of the nation's largest, most influential integrated healthcare delivery systems. Dr. Penso previously served as Chief Medical and Quality Officer for AMGA and President of the AMGA Foundation. Under his leadership, the impact of AMGA's quality program has grown to improve care to more than 26 million patients. Prior to joining AMGA, Dr. Penso served as Medical Director, where I first met him, at Sharp-Reed-Stealing Medical Group, which is the largest integrated healthcare delivery system in San Diego. Dr. Penso received his master's in business administration from San Diego State University, my alma mater, and his Doctor of Medicine degree from USC, a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Cal. Dr. Penso, as Hattie mentioned, was one of our first Right Care Initiative participants, as well as our first Leadership Award winner in 2009, and also co-founded and co-chaired the first University of Best Practices in San Diego. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Penso and thank him for joining us today.
And we also have, first of all, thank you, Cindy, for that wonderful introduction. My co-presenter will be Dr. John Cuddeback, and Dr. John Cuddeback was my partner in crime in helping to create this campaign that we'll be talking about. He's the Chief Medical Informatics Officer at AMGA, and as CMIO, he's expanded our foundation's model for collaborative shared learning among AMGA member organizations. He's added insights from comparative analysis of longitudinal EHR data. He's long advocated, as well as AMGA, for moving healthcare from volume to value, aligning payment incentives with improving population health. He leads our research implementation science division and focuses on how members can adapt and scale evidence-based practices and innovation. He previously served as CMIO of MedStar Health here in the DC area. And prior to that, as Chief Information Officer and then Vice President of Health Policy at the University of Florida. Received his MD and PhD in physiology and statistics from Indiana University, completed his residency in clinical pathology at UF, and he received his BS in physics from Case Western Reserve University, and he is among the smartest people that I know. So John, I'm so glad that you're here with me. I was asked before we get started to reminisce a little bit on that first University of Best Practices meeting that we had in San Diego. And Hattie will remember as well, and some of you in the room, Jim, I think you will remember as well. We walked into that room in that beautiful location overlooking the Pacific Ocean on the campus of UC San Diego, which generously gave us the site to meet. And as we walked into that room, and I can tell you, as I walked into that room, there was palpable excitement. First of all, you ever throw a party and you wonder if anyone's going to show up? Well, they showed up. They showed up, and they showed up almost every single care delivery system within San Diego. So we had not only the private healthcare systems, but we had the community healthcare divisions with the FQHCs. We had the County of San Diego, who took care and helped coordinate the care of the uninsured and the vulnerable populations. We also had the VA and the Department of Defense. And when we looked around the room, we realized that nearly 90+% of the population of San Diego was represented in that room. And it was a little bit awesome because we realized together we could actually do quite a bit. So that's my reminiscence of that first meeting. What you could tell is right away, we all were on the same wavelength. We were all excited by the vision of improving care and Dr. DeMario's vision of eliminating heart attacks and strokes within San Diego. So I just want to thank my co-conspirators for working with me during the time I was in San Diego. And I think you'll hear a lot of echoes of what I learned in San Diego, and I tried my best to bring to a national stage. So with that, let's get moving. And we're going to talk about what we did, John Cuddeback, myself, and many others throughout the country to try to improve hypertension on a national scale. A couple of caveats. The campaign ended in 2015. Now, that means our official AMGA support and work on the campaign ended in 15, but many medical groups and many health systems across the country continued that work. And I still get updates from systems around the country of how they're working to continue implementing what we're going to show you to improve high blood pressure. I'm hoping that some of the lessons we learned, and to be candid, we learned a lot during this campaign of what to do and maybe what not to do. And we'd love to do that during the Q&A and answer any of your questions about where we went, where we did well, and maybe where we could have done better. But we learned as we went along. So we're going to discuss what we did from a quality improvement standpoint on a national basis. I also want to say as a caveat, neither John Cuddeback or I are experts in hypertension. Probably in this room, there's a lot more expertise on the latest research and study. But what I think we are really good at is taking the knowledge that has been out there and trying to help implement that throughout the country on a national scale, medical groups and health systems that we represent. So with that, let's go to why did we do this? Why are you working in high blood pressure? Well, the number of people in this country with high blood pressure is just astronomical. According to CDC, half of adults have a blood pressure above 130/80, according to the website, or are taking medications for hypertension. 50% of adults. Of those, unfortunately, only 24% are considered in control. And there are 45% of those with high blood pressure with a blood pressure of 140/90, putting them at much higher risk. There are 34 million, and John Cuddeback's going to talk about this as well, who may need to take a medication who aren't taking a medication right now. So there is a huge gap and huge opportunity. In addition, the costs are astronomical. 114 billion according to the CDC. It is a primary or contributing cause of death for over 500,000 people, 500,000 Americans each year. And that's according to 2019 data. So a huge cost, a huge number of Americans affected. And it seemed like a great opportunity for AMGA to leverage some of their assets, which I'll go over in just a second, to make a difference in this area. If you look at the next slide, you'll see that we, by looking at the data, saw that it wasn't just hypertension universally across the country, which it is, of course, but it's concentrated in certain areas. AMGA, we have members throughout all the country, including the states that are listed as quite red. But this, of course, indicates that there are differential opportunities for how to schedule these interventions and the different groups that participate in the campaign. In addition, there are gender, race, ethnicity differences, and this is also from the CDC site. 50% of adult men are noted to have high blood pressure compared to 44% of women. 56% of non-Hispanic Blacks are noted to have high blood pressure compared to 48% of non-Hispanic whites. And in addition, which is not on this slide, those populations, Black, Hispanic patients, have a much poorer control rate. So huge opportunities in this area. It's expensive, it's common, and there's lots of opportunities to gain better control. So when I went to AMGA and led as our first Chief Medical Officer and led foundation, we said, what could we do? And it turns out we could do a lot. We have 400 medical groups and health system members across the country. As I stated, we're in every single state. Our medical groups and health systems are often the largest prominent medical groups and health systems with organized systems of care. We like to say that our groups really understand what it means to be a system, and therefore they have data, they have registries often, they have physician groups that are organized in specific ways, often a common EHR, and often a quality improvement infrastructure. So we could leverage that going forward. Again, it was kind of exciting, almost similar to walking into that room in San Diego to see the scope and the scale that AMGA could do in this and other areas. 177,000 physicians are represented. Those are FTE physicians throughout the country. And one of these days, we're going to have to update the slide because we're not counting APPs in our registry at AMGA, but we know that those are more and more common throughout our medical groups and health systems. And if you add up the care that is delivered by AMGA members, 142 million Americans receive care from our members, over 1 in 3 Americans. So we had this incredible opportunity because of the scale that we had. In addition, you can see on the next slide, we had just a wonderful breadth of members, including many who are here today. Cindy from Memorial Care is a member in San Diego, Scripps and Sharp, Stanford and UC and Sutter Health, many groups that are California represented, and Kaiser Permanente, thank you very much. So let me take you back in history. One of the reasons I went to AMGA was my passion for quality improvement. We have a foundation, that's our 501c3, our nonprofit foundation, that's an arm of the AMGA Trade Association. And its mission is very clear: to help our medical groups and systems improve health and the healthcare that they deliver. It had done a number of pilot projects in all sorts of different areas, but had never done anything even remotely close to a national campaign. One of our board members, who happened to come from Kaiser Permanente, pulled the foundation board together and said, if you really want to make an impact, and this was Jay Crossan from Kaiser Permanente, if you really want to make an impact, what we're learning at Kaiser is focus on hypertension. That's an area where we could reduce mortality, reverse morbidity, and we're beginning to have some success in that area, is what Jay said. So why doesn't AMGA leverage its assets, which I showed you? Large number of physician practices. Often many of them are very organized with underlying coordination systems and underlying data and underlying quality improvement methodologies. Why don't you get them organized in a campaign, get some excitement, get some engagement, and see if we can really make a difference. So that's the origin of the campaign that I'm going to demonstrate to you. On the next slide, you'll see that we did do that campaign. Our first campaign was called Measure Up, Pressure Down. The campaign was the years 2012 to 2015. And again, we started it. We didn't know if anyone would join us. We had 128 groups in 36 states, representing 47,000 FTE physicians that participated in that campaign. And our goal was pretty lofty, and we'll talk about that in a bit, maybe too high, but our goal was that each of these participating groups would achieve 80% blood pressure control according to national measures. We ended the campaign in 15. And the reason we ended the campaign is we heard from our groups that about a 3 or 4 year campaign, maybe 5 years at max, is about as long as they can keep their attention. There's a lot of turnover in groups, a lot of changes. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't continue to focus on those areas, but as far as national campaign and keeping the excitement it generated, about 3 to 5 years is about maximum that we could really go. We then had our next campaign, but our next campaign was Together to Goal and focused on diabetes, but not just diabetes. We had 5 measures that we were focusing on, including hypertension control in patients with diabetes, in people with diabetes. And that one was even more successful with 150 groups in 37 states. That's not the focus of today's lecture, but we had a good chunk, 3.5 million patients with type 2 diabetes, a good chunk of the population throughout the country that we worked hard to improve those measures, including blood pressure. And we leveraged what we knew from Measure Up, Pressure Down to help focus in that area. And then finally, our most recent campaign that we just started a few months ago is called Rise to Immunize. And we're looking at adult vaccines. We're looking at 4 vaccines. And our goal, again, pretty lofty, is to have 25 million vaccines, flu, pneumococcal, HPV, as well as shingles, delivered to adults during this campaign, adults and adolescents. So that's our lofty goal, to administer by 25, and we already have a huge number of groups that are participating in that campaign. So that's a little bit of background on AMGA, why we would even embark on trying to undertake the campaign. So let me give you a little background on how we look at campaigns. And I think you'll see, again, a lot of echoes of what I learned at University of Best Practices and at Sharp Healthcare. The first thing is we picked a goal. In the Measure Up, Pressure Down campaign, we focused on 80% control in the groups that were participating. How did we pick that goal? Well, we had a history. We had done, as I mentioned, these pilot programs, these collaboratives. And in the collaboratives, learning collaboratives, we'd work with groups for a year using measures to try to get a certain parameter, a certain chronic disease under better control. We had run 2 collaboratives with high blood pressure, and we had the success of some of those groups hitting 80% control. So we thought that if 1 or 2 groups could do it, you know what, they all could do it. Measures. We think this is what differentiates, and again, I think University of Best Practices as well as AMGA campaigns. This is not an awareness campaign. This is not public service announcement campaign. This is really a campaign about quality improvement. So we had specific measures that we required the groups that participate to report their numerators and denominators. And as John will explain, in many of the groups, we had even more detailed data to understand, were they improving control? Campaign planks, we learned from our groups that participated in the collaboratives, groups just didn't want a direction. They just didn't want a goal and measurement. They wanted more specifics. They want to know, what do we need to do to improve care? What are the specific interventions that we can do that would have the maximal impact on getting us to goal? As I mentioned, we did quarterly data reporting, and that had a couple effects. Number one, it kept everyone engaged. Number two, there's a little bit of competition, and we would have the groups every month log into the site, and they could see how they were performing compared to all the other groups in the campaign. A little bit of competition is a good thing. We developed a campaign toolkit, and we'll be reviewing some of those campaign tools today. But again, our groups wanted to know not just what they were supposed to do, but how to do it, and how leading groups across the country were beginning to figure this out. A lot of peer-to-peer education. We did monthly webinars. We tried to have the groups teach each other. Stakeholder engagement, we worked with all sorts of other groups outside of our members, but we work with our members, and we work with national leaders, including Million Hearts, to help us guide this campaign. Communications was key. We had a monthly newsletter that went out every month to keep groups engaged. We had webinars, we had a website, all sorts of communication techniques. And then finally, recognition. Groups loved recognition. They loved to see, were they improving? Were they and we even divided it by different categories. So were you the most improved? Were you a small group? Were you a medium-sized group? Were you a big group? We tried to get the recognition out there because we know that really encourages and engages the team. So that's our framework that we used, and we applied it to this campaign. We actually built it for this campaign and then applied it to future campaigns. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Cuddeback.
Thank you, Jerry. I'll stay on this slide for a minute to talk about one of our other really important parts of our campaigns, and that is our team of advisors from AMGA members. We actually hit our high water mark with Together to Goal, our diabetes campaign. We had 3 different advisory committees. And Jim Duddle is the only person to serve on all 3, and he made substantive contributions to every one of them. But for Measure Up, Pressure Down, we had Larry Fine from the NIH, who was the program officer for the SPRINT trial. And he was, he kept emphasizing as we were looking at goals and as we were trying to figure out how we were going to approach measurement, this study that was published in 2002 in Lancet, it's a meta-analysis of 61 prospective studies that relates mortality during each decade of age to death at age to death, at death, to the estimated usual blood pressure at the start of that decade. So as you can imagine, the statistics for tracking that are pretty complicated, and even more so when you're doing a meta-analysis. But look at the regressions. They are amazing. And this is over those 61 prospective studies, 56,000 vascular deaths and 12.7 million person years. So you can see that for across each of the decades, there's a remarkably consistent relationship. And remember, this is a log scale. So going up in the log scale, you know, you're doing multiples, you're not doing additive addition. So for example, at ages 40 to 69 years, going up 20 millimeters of mercury in systolic pressure or 10 millimeters in diastolic pressure is associated with about a 2-fold difference in mortality. And that is consistent down to 115 millimeters of mercury, usual systolic, and about 75 millimeters usual diastolic. So this is obviously a good deal of the thinking that was beyond the sprint, behind the sprint trial, the idea of understanding how low we could go and continue to get additional improvement in survival. But here's the one for coronary heart disease mortality. Here's the one for stroke mortality. So tremendous relationship between blood pressure and mortality from these two causes. Something really important, I think, to think about. I know you're probably already thinking in these terms to undertake the initiative you are with blood pressure for right care. Jerry?
So we went out and we designed this campaign. And to be honest, we designed it as we were doing it. And we asked our medical groups who had never done anything like this with us before, would you join us? And we were very pleasantly surprised. Those red circles, each one indicates the size of the group that participated, the number of FTE physicians. So that shows you the scope across the country of the groups that participated. And together, they cared for 42 million patients. So we were, again, very excited that the interest among our medical groups and health systems was there, and that they were very interested in working together to improve care. I think that's the other secret sauce, is the collaborative nature of this project, as well as, I think the quality improvement. Our groups share relentlessly, and you'll see some examples of that today, but they share all the resources and tools and websites and videos that really help their fellow groups improve. The campaign planks. We built these, again, with our advisory group, looking at the results of the collaboratives that we did. We did 2 collaboratives, 20 groups in each one, so 40 groups. We had some experience of working with them at least over the course of a year. And this is what they told us worked. So this is what we built as far as the campaign planks. The first line, that kind of, it looks kind of a teal color to me, we call those the primary process planks. We thought that the second row was going to be more challenging. So we wanted to give people who wanted to participate in the campaign an easier entry point to begin to participate. And we told groups, just pick one. All you had to do was pick one plank to join the campaign. You didn't have to pick all of these planks. You didn't have to commit to, to implementing each one. But our hope was, if you picked one, that you would start with the one that made sense for you, and then you would move on to your second, third, and fourth. And our hope is that by doing all of these things, this was what our groups told us and our advisors told us would get them into the best blood pressure control. Under each of these planks was the toolkit that we built around that. So under each one of these, we identified best practices that a member group was already doing in that area. And over the course of the campaign, as groups began implementing the planks, we gathered more and more of these practices, and we shared them relentlessly. We shared them in our journal, we shared them in our conferences, we shared them on our website. So our toolkit actually grew over time, and groups found what was working for them or not, sometimes small things, sometimes bigger things. So we did what I like to call our R&D. We robbed and duplicated, and we encouraged all of our groups to do the same thing, to capture what they could in each of these areas. So what we're going to do today, after John explains some of the data issues, what we're going to do is go one by one, explain what the plank was and some of the key lessons that we learned while implementing that plank.
Thanks, Jerry. As I will demonstrate, sometimes the data people can be a little overbearing, but I'll try to give you a bit of background on how we decided to do the measurement. And we we're fortunate to, through a partnership with a population health analytics company, Humedica, which was then acquired by Optum, and it became a partnership with Optum. We had longitudinal data from a number of our members' patients, up to two and a half dozen AMGA members at different times who were contributing data. And we were able to look at the longitudinal data of each of their patients and use that to kind of understand measurement issues within individual medical groups. It was a range of members from large to small, so we had a pretty good exposure to that. So for example, one of the ways we used the data was to determine among the hypertension patients seen during a 12-month period, because most people think in terms of about a 12-month period for a quality measure. 60% have their last office visit during the last 3 months of that 12-month period. So if you look quarter by quarter by quarter at the trailing 12 months, so the 12 months that are ended at the end of that quarter, then you've got essentially a weighted measure that's about 60% weighted toward the folks who came in during the last 3 months, and presumably what was done for them. And then the other 40% of the people within the past year were a little earlier. So it seemed that just doing rolling 12-month periods reported quarterly would give us a reasonably fast response when people changed their practices, but also kind of fit with the expectation of a normal 12-month kind of measurement period. So that's the way we approached it. Another of our advisors who gave us some very good advice early on and stayed with us during the campaign was Mark Jaffe from Kaiser Permanente, Northern California. And as Jerry mentioned, what they achieved over 2001 to 2008 and published in a couple of different places is really remarkable improvement in the proportion of patients with hypertension whose blood pressure was in control. But one of the really interesting things, so this shows the percent of patients in control. You can see going from 36, more than doubling the proportion in control. But another thing that's really important here is that during that time, many more individuals with hypertension were discovered. And if you think about it, there's controlled blood pressure, there's uncontrolled blood pressure, and then there is unsuspected hypertension. So from a population perspective, it's really important to understand the prevalence of hypertension within your population and make sure that you are measuring broadly within your population to identify the people who might have hypertension, because you can see here the proportion of patients improved who are in control, but the number within the Kaiser Permanente Northern California population improved expanded tremendously as well. So when we asked our members to report, we asked them to report not just a denominator, the number of hypertension patients with at least one evaluation and management visit during the measurement period, the 12-month measurement period, and the numerator, the proportion of those, the number of those whose last blood pressure was in control at our 140/90 measure threshold, but also to give us the total number of patients in the age range, of course, with at least one E&M visit so that they could calculate both prevalence and control. Now you can see that different members, if we look across all of these members who reported during one selected quarter, you can see that prevalence changed some, and some folks did choose to focus a little more on subset populations where prevalence was really high. But I think this issue of making sure that you're looking at least at prevalence for diagnosed hypertension is important. And there's a tool that was developed by CDC, team led by Matt Ritchie at CDC, but was adopted by Million Hearts. And you can see here the link to the Million Hearts website where this tool is available. And if we go to the Million Hearts website, you'll see something like this. I've actually sort of overwritten their little pink box with some details about the prevalence estimator tool. But the idea here is that if you input something about the demographics of your population, then it can tell you what is the likely prevalence of hypertension. And then you can determine whether that's what you're seeing and whether you might be missing some patients that you should expect to have hypertension. Now, they did a logistic regression using NHANES data. And NHANES, you know, is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And they actually bring people in and do clinical measurements. So they were measuring blood pressure. So they were determining in NHANES the prevalence of blood pressure of 140/90 or a self-reported diagnosis of hypertension and the use of blood pressure medication. So those are the two things they're sort of predicting in this logistic regression model. And they tried to make it as parsimonious as possible, but still be a good predictor. So they came up with 4 age categories: sex, race, and ethnicity, and just a couple of combined categories for that. And then of the 3 most important comorbidities, it's the count of those comorbidities that you put in. So the patients who do not have diabetes, obesity, or chronic kidney disease get a 1. Or you might have 1 of those or 2 or 3, but it doesn't matter whether it's 2 or 3. So that's what you put into the prevalence estimator. We, as I mentioned, have this longitudinal data for a number of our AMGA members. These are the ones in light green. And so we were able to view these sort of as instrumented practices. They would make changes, and then we could see in their EHRs, when we had all of their longitudinal EHR data, their the response. And so here are just some summary data for 32 AMGA member organizations who were using Optum-1 at the time. It was 9.6 million total patients who had an ambulatory visit between July of 2013 and June of 2014. The CDC prevalence estimator gave us 35.9%. Now, their actual hypertension prevalence, if you looked at either diagnosis on a claim, an outbound claim, or in the problem list in the EHR, was 33.6%. If you looked at their hypertension prevalence by a diagnosis or problem list diagnosis, but also elevated blood pressure on at least 2 different days, meaning elevated 140/90 or higher, that probably is estimating a little high, as you would expect, because not everybody who has 2 blood pressures on different days over 140/90 should be considered hypertensive. There's some judgment involved in that, but at any rate, this just gives you a sense of it's kind of comforting to know that the prevalence estimator is closer to your actual diagnosed numbers. And if you look at the diagnosed numbers, 22.4% of the adult patients had both a diagnosis on a claim and on their problem list. There were about 8% who only had a diagnosis on a claim, not on a problem list, which is an opportunity for improvement in the EHR, because everybody on the team should certainly know that this patient has a diagnosis of hypertension, even though they might be controlled on medication when they are seen and their blood pressure is below the threshold. And then there are 3.3% where the diagnosis was on the problem list but never appeared on a claim. Some of those patients might have had other chronic conditions that dominated their treatment in most of the visits, so therefore it didn't show up on a claim. We looked at this at individual organization level, and so you can see, we'll just select a couple of organizations. Here's number 5, where the prevalence is somewhere in the low 30s, maybe 34, estimated prevalence based on the demographics of their patient population, but you can see their diagnosed prevalence on either a claim or problem list is only 20%. So this is what the prevalence estimator is designed to catch, is when you are seriously under recording and diagnosing hypertension in your patient population. And here you can see kind of the other situation. Either this is a higher risk population than maybe even those demographic characteristics or the categories that were included in the logistic regression model accounted for, but you can sort of get the idea that this group is actually seeing more patients with hypertension. And if you look at the difference in hypertension prevalence between the estimator and then minus the actual numbers, and if you let your actual be diagnosis or problem list, you can see that in most cases, the actual is a little less than the predicted. In some cases, like number 5, it's a lot less. But so, you know, these are folks who should certainly look at their frequency of diagnosing hypertension. You can see here that the actual, if you're now taking this much broader definition of just 2 days with blood pressure 140/90, that actual will be greater than predicted in most cases, but by different amounts. So again, something worth looking at, making sure that you're looking at the population you want to be looking at for a hypertension project. Another thing that we learned to deal with was we had quarterly measurements, and we learned early on that there would be seasonality in those measures. So if you learn nothing else from today's presentation, if you are going to do a major campaign on blood pressure control, end it in the 3rd quarter, because you get a benefit from the 3rd quarter. Maybe it's that people are outdoors, they're exercising more, they're doing more physical activity, the kinds of things that tend to help with blood pressure control. But you can see all of these groups, even though there's a steady increase in the control, that's sort of swamped by the quarter to quarter variation in seasonality. So if you actually look into the Optum data that we had from our members, you can see that the blood pressure control, and this is during the baseline period for Together to Goal, which was during the actual measure up, pressure down, you can see the increase that was occurring in all of these groups during measure up, pressure down, but a pretty large seasonal variation, generally peaking with best control during August or maybe September. So you have these blood pressure peaks in August. Now, while we're looking at this, the reason we were doing this was to sort of think about planning for Together to Goal, our diabetes campaign. So we wanted to look at A1C control as well. Well, this was during the baseline for Together to Goal, but there was nothing going on, at least across all AMGA members. So you can see there was no improvement in A1C like we had seen with blood pressure during measure up, pressure down. But interestingly, the peaks are now in December. So you've got A1C peaks in December, and then you put that together with the August peaks in blood pressure, and you think about a Together to Goal bundle measure, which has A1C, blood pressure, statin prescribing, and medical attention to nephropathy. And so you can see that during this same period, most of the improvement is due to the improvement in blood pressure control, because measure up, pressure down was going on during this time. But it turns out that when you combine everything into a bundle, there's really not much seasonality to statin prescribing and nephropathy. So the bundle peaks wind up being in September. So you had the blood pressure peaks in August, the A1C peaks in December, and then you can see the bundle peaks, the net effect of combining them all in September. And then, of course, as you're going down here, you can see sort of the February and March kind of low points as well. So just an interesting little data experience. Another experience that we had was, so what happens when new guidelines come out in the middle of your campaign? And these new guidelines never fully adopted the way JNC 7 and 6 had been adopted in quite the same way. from the JNC8 National Committee. The recommendations, they called it an evidence-based guideline, was for people who were 60 and older without diabetes or chronic kidney disease, the blood pressure threshold could be relaxed a little bit to 150 over 90 rather than 140 over 90. So we look at our patient population, we see that 61% of the patients with hypertension are age 60 or older, but 34% without diabetes or CKD. So almost half of them have diabetes or CKD. Turns out only 4% are age 60 or older without diabetes or CKD with their last systolic blood pressure in the range that would be affected, which is 140 to 149. So what we did was display for our members who were participating in the campaign. And at this point, we had data from 24 of our members with our Humedica Optum data set. And we looked at the blood pressure not recorded. So when you got EHR data, you notice that there are some folks who are having E&M visits, but not having blood pressure recorded. We'll talk about that in the plank about specialists in a little while. You have people who are known to be out of control. You have people who are in control under the 140 over 90 guideline, but then you have people who are in control over, this is the 4%, and it differs a little bit in distribution, but it's roughly 4%. But there was a lot of discussion among our members about, should we change things? Should we adjust our goals? And so the wise guidance we got from our advisory committee was to emphasize the patients who were out of control under any guideline. This 4% is probably less important in the long run than the much larger proportion of people who are over 150 over 90, and particularly those who have stage 2 blood pressure, 160 over 100. So instead of thinking about the blue and talking about them, shift your focus to the folks who really need some attention, and probably urgently, because they have stage 2 blood pressure, and it's an even larger proportion of the total population. So since then, we have new guidelines. These are partially the result of the SPRINT trial. And so I will show you when we get to this point a little farther in the presentation, what we are doing about reporting in these bar charts, because you have to have stacked bar charts with multiple segments if you're going to talk about all of the details of the current recommendations. The one thing I do think is important to point out, though, is how important it is for an individual group. And here is some more current data. But we are looking at one group here, and I'll show you this group in context with other AMGA members that are participating in this benchmarking and shared learning collaborative. But the idea, group 10, 74% are in control, 140 over 90, 26% are out of control. If we look at sites of care across all participants, it is really interesting to see how much variation there is. And you can see the 80th percentile is 79% control, the 20th percentile is 68% control. The goal for this collaborative turned out to be 76% because it was set based on some national data released by CMS. The 50th percentile was 74, but just for this one organization, we'll call it group 10, you can see that they had almost a 20% range from one of their sites of care. And of course, these are sites of care with numerous patients who have hypertension. So we're leaving out all of their small offices just to make sure that they're clear that, you know, this is a 20% span between this site of care and this site of care, which is doing really well. And as Jerry always points out, you know, you tend to look at this and you think, boy, these people need help, let's focus on them. But if you think about these people as positive deviants, the folks who are doing really well with the same resources that everybody else has, and the potential to learn from them, let's first go talk about the people who are in this part of the curve. And that's one of the real benefits of doing this kind of detailed tracking of performance, is that you find out who is doing really well and you learn from them. Maybe the people who just used to be here and just learned recently how to get from there to here, maybe they're the best teachers for the folks down here. But at any rate, it's just important to understand, I think, that there is, even though you have quality measures that tend to be rolled up at the level of an individual organization, that you really need to look inside the organizations to recognize, because most organizations have a group that's doing pretty well, from whom all of their other sites of care can learn. So Jerry's going to talk now about the lessons learned by Planck.
And John, I wonder if we might just pause a second for any questions. That was a lot of wonderful data and background that, again, we learned as we went along with this campaign, as we really explored the data. John and his team does a great job. I see one comment from Nathan Wong. Thank you for that comment. Jim Duddle probably remembers there was a lot of disagreement when JNC 8 came out and how to handle it. And we even had, I think, a webinar with a debate over different, positions and what to do. And we landed on the fact that there's a commonality for the groups who, let's say, like the more relaxed measures versus didn't, as John Cuddeback pointed out. Why don't we just focus on what we all agree upon, which is a huge target?
Right.
Are there any other questions that are coming across? I don't know if I can see them all, but I want to make sure that you use the expertise of John Cuddeback if you have any questions about our interesting data.
Can you go back to slide?
So John, this is Bill Baumer. I had a question. This is tremendous data that you're showing, and including the seasonality and everything else. What is the cost of getting all of this monitoring? How many FTEs did you need to put together this type of incredible data analysis?
Well, there are several steps in the process, and this is why we partnered with Humedica, because they initially started with a number of our members who were interested in population health management in general. And so they went to the trouble of extracting EHR data, longitudinal EHR data from each of them, mapping it and normalizing it and combining it. There are now a number of companies that do that. As I mentioned, Humedica was acquired by Optum in 2013. And so we enjoyed a long and very fruitful data partnership with Optum. And this is, so Optum actually does the extraction and combining of the data. And then we have just a team of analysts, a relatively small team of probably 2 or 3 people working on a campaign at a time. We have about 15 total in our research group at AMGA, but just a couple working on with each of our campaigns or collaboratives. So it's really the heavy lifting is done by our data partner. We have a new data partnership now with Lightbeam Health Solutions. But at any rate, they're the ones who actually do the extraction and compilation of the data. And then we just take the longitudinal look and summarize things.
It looks like we have a question from Michael Cantor.
Yeah, I hope I'm not on mute.
Nope.
Oh, great. This is really incredible. It's like, I have like 500 questions to ask you all. I'm very intrigued by the prevalence issue, and it's something I've talked about. And it's nice to compare. I'm glad I like the comparison of the CDC calculator, but begs the question to me. You showed data with 43%, I believe, of prevalence if you just look at 2 high blood pressures. and it was much lower if you look at what was diagnosed and treated. So I guess my question is, how do you know that all of those people with the too high blood pressures don't have hypertension? And is that something that should be targeted in your view?
Well, I would leave it to hypertension experts to comment more than for me, but I think it certainly is the kind of thing that if you are in a situation like, say, this group here, or maybe this group here, where you have that occurring a lot, I mean, I think one of the, we'll talk in a little bit about accurate measurement of blood pressure, because that's our first plank. And we had a really good webinar from Sharon Pascal at Cleveland Clinic on how to do that, and all of the things that can raise the blood pressure. And Jerry will probably tell a story about a recent measurement of his blood pressure. So I think what this kind of raises is the question, and we've actually got some more data on rounding of blood pressures as well, is people really should be looking at their own data within, because it's usually possible. There's usually some sort of reporting workbench or something like that within an EHR that will allow you to look at your data across different subsets of your patient population. And I think these are exactly the kinds of questions you should be looking at. Are we recording blood pressures appropriately? Are we underdiagnosing and maybe, but if, for example, we're recording a lot of people with 2 blood pressures over whatever our threshold is on separate days, but not diagnosing very many of those people, is that because we really don't believe that we're recording blood pressure in a reliable way, and we're willing to kind of ignore it because this isn't the sort of thing we should ignore if it's real? So I think that's the conversation we're hoping to stimulate within the member groups.
Yeah, I can just tell you from our experience, we monitor that through exactly what you said and bring the patients back in for another check. And I can't give you exact numbers on how many we ultimately diagnose as hypertension, but it's a sizable opportunity, at least in our hands.
Very good point. Thank you.
John, I saw a question about from Kimberly. Do you know if there's a prevalence estimator like the one you shared for hypertension for diabetes and/or heart failure?
I am not aware of one, but it's certainly a good question, because we in Together to Goal did see a reasonable variation in the prevalence of type 2 diabetes, diagnosed prevalence. Absolutely. I think it's one of those things that you often forget when you just look at a quality measure. You think, okay, here's the denominator, but and now we'll see how we're performing, but it's really important to think about your population as a whole and make sure your denominator is what it should be.
Have any other questions come in? I don't know if I see them all, but okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on, but thank you. And thank you, John. As you can see, I am blessed to work with John and the analytics team that provides all this data that helped guide our campaign. So it all starts with measurement. As John said, as we were putting these slides again together, I had gone for my routine physical at a member group, an AMJ member group who will go on to show how the education cannot stop. This has to be an ongoing issue. What we learned from our collaboratives is if the blood pressure, and remember, we're going back to 2015 when the campaign was going on, is not accurate. And most of them were manual at the time. And we're seeing a number of our groups switch to automated or electronic cuffs. But even then, there's correct education and technique on how to take that cuff. So as I go into my exam less than a month ago, of course, do they have me take off my jacket? Do they have me take off? No, they just put the cuff right on top of everything. And as I politely pointed it out. They go, no, that's okay. That's how we take blood pressure here. So,
Wow.
so a lot of education, I think, still needs to be done. What we learned through the collaboratives is if the blood pressures as taken by usually the support staff are not believed by those who are going to make interventions, the physicians and the APPs, the whole thing stops in its track. It's like your whole system kind of collapses because there's this sense of, that the blood pressures aren't accurate. Can I really, take action based on them? Or even worse, in my opinion, as far as rework, that the physician and the APP may recheck the blood pressure. And just to be candid, many of them aren't trained in accurate blood pressure measurement. And you may even not get an accurate one in that. So we always said step one, really working with staff to train it. As John mentioned on the next step, our first webinar was on accurate blood pressure measurement. Cleveland Clinic, Sharon Pascal, who was there at the time, gave this wonderful lecture, and we're going to make that available to everyone. We still think it's very, very important, but she gave what they do at Cleveland Clinic for staff education on accurate blood pressure measurement. It all starts with equipment. Do you have the right cuff sizes? When I visited member groups and talked to them, we noticed many of the groups didn't even have all the cuff sizes available to the providers. Simple things like, are you talking while the blood pressure is being measured? Are your legs crossed? Is your positioning good for the arm and the back supported? And a whole host of other things. This is, and Scott makes a good point there. Thank you. I'm reading that as I go on. The patient may say, hey, if this wasn't taken accurate, maybe I really shouldn't believe it. So again, this lecture is available. It's still very accurate and it's wonderful. And she goes over the competencies that Cleveland Clinic requires of their staff to pass in order to make sure that the blood pressures are being accurately taken. We took it a step forward because we're data people and we wanted to see what was going on. And probably the most common anecdote that we heard from practicing physicians is, how come every one of my patients has a blood pressure of 120/70 today? Well, it turned out in some groups, this was true. We call this terminal digit preference. In some of the groups, you can see there on the upper group, these are 3 medical groups where you see like a nice bell-shaped curve, a range of those terminal digits. But in other groups, this is a couple of groups down below where we had their data on blood pressure measurements. Lo and behold, on the systolic blood pressure, they all ended in 0, a high preference for zeros. And we even took this a step further. We said, gosh, you could actually measure this in your group and you could actually see, does your group have a terminal digit preference? And maybe that's an indication for that group or that clinic or that office practice, maybe to do some re-education to make sure that all the patients don't have zeros in their blood pressure. So we created this measure. We actually designed a measure where groups could actually test it and see if this is really happening in their groups, because seeing is believing when you see the data. So again, you could test and you could add up all the zeros, the 110s, the 120s, and get a percentage of those that end in 0, a percentage that end in 2, 4, 6, and 8. And of course, it could be in the middle if you're using automated cuffs. On the next slide, you can see that there was, lo and behold, variation. Each of these bars, vertical bars, is a group. And you can see that one group in the middle, over 50%, it's amazing, ended in 0, both the diastolic and the systolic in this one group. So that's a group that may want to look at what they're doing as far as accurate blood pressure and how are they educating staff? Do they have the right equipment? But again, this is a tool that a group could use to track how they're doing. So in the next slide, we saw that some groups actually did that. And some groups, group 1, 2, and 3, their intervention was to invest in automatic blood pressure cuffs. Now, fortunately today, these blood pressure cuffs are a lot more reasonably priced and available. Back then in 2015, they were not as ubiquitous and very expensive for groups to invest in. But those groups that did, you saw there was a change. The blood pressure terminal digit issue went away, and we're hoping and assuming that the accuracy of the blood pressure measurement got much better. And group 4 and 5, they didn't invest, but they actually did more investment in that. They didn't invest in automated cuffs, but what they did invest in is education and probably monitoring and competencies. And again, they saw improvements there, maybe not as dramatic, but they did see improvements. Fortunately, today there are automatic cuffs. I think that's the next slide. Omron 907X apparently was used in the SPRINT study, much more reasonably cost. Welcome your comments on what you all are using. We're finding that more and more of our groups, because of the cost issue, are going to these more automated cuffs. Much more accurate reading than maybe we were getting in the old system. But again, it does not mean that the competencies aren't important, because again, it's a positioning, having the right size cuff, making sure that the patient is rested for 5 minutes, not just having had a big cup of coffee, et cetera. These are all important factors to make sure that you get the right blood pressure in the office. Not to mention, and we're not going to discuss, because home measurement was not part of the process, and we know that many of our groups are using home measurements as well as an augmentation for diagnosis and treatment. So I think are you next, John, or I think I keep going. Hypertension guideline. Thank you to, again, Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente published this result, again, Mark Jaffe, to show that if you can make it simple for the providers to treat the blood pressure, all the guidelines have a lot of options, but if you can make it simple, they started with lisinopril hydrochlorothiazide, had a very simple algorithm on how to increase it before adding another medicine. There were a lot of things, but when I talked to Mark, what this gave the patient was very much a roadmap on how they were going to be treated. Many patients, as you come in and you treat them, what we heard from the physicians is they feel like a failure if they have to add another medicine, if they have to keep adjusting it. But if you tell the patient coming in, most patients need 2 medicines. We're going to start you on that. We're going to gradually increase the dose till you get you under control, and we're going to do it rapidly. The patient feels much more like a success. So we borrowed from Kaiser Permanente this guideline, and not only did we borrow, but even Million Hearts borrowed. And they said, let's just create a generic treatment algorithm that groups can plug and play and see what they're doing. So if you see on the next slide, on the Million Hearts site, they created this nice little protocol that you can fill in as you feel appropriate for your medical group, your community. But the idea here is let's all agree on how to do it. Make it simple for the practitioners. Don't give them 18 choices for round 1. Make it as simple as possible, and you're going to get better control. And I think now I turn it over to you, John. And there's a question, can we send a link to the reference? Scott, are you talking to the article in JAMA or the Million Hearts, or both?
You can do both.
Okay. Yeah, we'll work on that. Got it.
So the question of blood pressure being addressed at every visit, every primary care visit in particular, sort of gets to this question of competing priorities. One of the things that we did early on is look at the distribution of patients by chronic condition. And as you can see, 9.1% of patients have hypertension. 9.5 has dyslipidemia and hypertension. Diabetes, dyslipidemia, and hypertension, 7.6%. And you can see all the combinations. In fact, it's kind of a minority that don't have any of the 8 or so chronic conditions we looked at, asthma, COPD, a couple of others. But at any rate, the point is, if you look at all of the combinations that involve hypertension, there's a lot to pay attention to. And if you think in terms not just of percent of patients, but percent of work RVUs, so, these are level 4 and 5 visits. There's a lot more decision making, a lot more to be thinking about. And the people with hypertension account for almost 2/3 of the work RVUs, but hypertension is accompanied by all of these other conditions that people need to pay attention to. So one of the lessons we learned from the data is the more visits you have, the better control. Now there is an asymptote, it does kind of top out here, but you can see the folks with just one visit, we had only 56% control, but it got up to 69%, 67, 68, and 69%. So as you had more visits, and a good fraction of the population did have 2 and 3 and 4 visits, you still had a few folks that didn't get their blood pressure measured, and this gets back mostly to people whose visits are in specialty practices. And we'll talk more about that later, but at any rate, you can see that there's a pretty good chance you won't have blood pressure measured if you only have one visit, but that proportion decreases over time with more visits. And Jerry?
So one of the things that I learned at Sharp Healthcare that we learned through the collaborative is what we call cycle time. That if the patient is diagnosed with hypertension, maybe a medication is adjusted, but you don't see them for what could be typically 90 days, a 33-month visit, which seemed to be the norm for some reason for hypertension. 1, the patient may stop taking their medicine. 2, the patient may not show up in 90 days. And 3, your opportunity to really intervene and get that patient under good control is good. And number 4, as John mentioned, by the time they come back in 90 days, there may be something else on their mind, some other problem that supersedes the blood pressure control, and the blood pressure just gets ignored. And we saw that over and over again. So to create some urgency, we recommend it as a campaign plank. If you're going to make a medication adjustment, if you're going to diagnose them, you need to see them back quickly, usually within 30 days. Well, guess what? That causes problems if everyone's supposed to be seeing people every 90 days, if your usual practice pattern was different. So we had to really get into the minds of the physicians and their nurses and their staff and begin to say, we know maybe you were quote unquote trained this way, but maybe there's a better way, and could you try it this way? One of the things that many groups tried was nurse visits in between visits, but that of course got to the issue of delegating tasks where the physician's comfortable. What if the nurse saw the patient, for example, on a day that the physician wasn't in the office and the blood pressure was really high? What would happen then? What are the protocols? Again, some of these challenges. What if they were being seen while the physician was seeing patients? Well, then you had rooming issues. What room can you see them in? Is the setup correct? And then, of course, the payer issues. Were you going to get paid for these nurse visits or not? If you were not, are you giving things away for free? Are there other issues with Medicare and other payers with offering services for free? So there were payer issues as well. And then, of course, access. Just physicians felt, if I'm supposed to see this patient in 30 days, there is just no way. Many physicians said, I just do not have the access. So trying to overcome this issue with 30-day visits was a challenge, probably underestimated by many of us, but we found that those groups that were able to figure this out and see the patients on a quicker cycle time were able to get the patients under control. I remember when I was in practice, what I would tell the patient, because sometimes there were patient issues here that I should mention as well, if they had co-pays, et cetera, and didn't want to come in. And I would tell the patients myself, listen, you come in now, I'll see you every month. We'll get you under good control. And then I don't need to see you again for a long time because you're going to be under good control. So there was sort of pay me now or maybe not have good blood pressure later. On the next plank, the prevention, engagement, self-management program in place. Really, this is the focus on the patient. And we know from all the data from chronic disease care models, et cetera, that the patient has to be very much the center of attention here and really part of the solution and that ownership piece. So this is again data from Kaiser Permanente. Thank you. This is from a pharmacist at Kaiser Permanente. And one of the issues we know is that adherence is quite, let's say, not great. Now, again, back then we didn't measure adherence as well as we do now with Part D and et cetera. But back then, this was Kaiser data indicating that we know that half the patients at the end of 3 months are not taking their blood pressure medicine. So how did you get to that 50%? According to the data from Kaiser, from this pharmacist, 12% didn't even pick up their initial prescription. Another chunk, it looks like 12% didn't even, maybe picked it up, but didn't even take it after the first few days. And then if you're looking for 3 months, they kept taking it, you drop down quite a bit. So at each point, there's a drop off, there's a little gap. And by the time you get to 3 months, a sizable population is not taking the medicine. So this gets also to that issue of why see them every month. It's a chance to reinforce adherence, the importance of medications, and of course, to check for side effects and other reasons for non-adherence. The other thing we learned during the campaign was from the American Heart Association. They did a wonderful focus group of physicians as well as patients with hypertension, trying to understand why patients aren't in control. And they came up with the thought that part of the problem is the nonchalant mindset. And the nonchalant works on both sides. It works on the practitioners and the physicians and other caregivers, as well as the patient. We see hypertension so often, as John Cuddeback shows. It's just very common. And we treat it like routinely. Therefore, it gives the impression to the patient that this isn't maybe as big a deal as it should be. It'd be very, different as I heard from, American Heart. If we took that patient, threw him in the emergency room, had 3 or 4 people circling around them talking about, this latest emergency, like we do with PTCA. Yet hypertension, we treat very nonchalant. And the message that we're giving to patients is, this really may not be that big of a deal. And that could lead to non-adherence. That could lead to patients not coming in for their appointments. And again, add that with a 3-month follow-up. And the whole messaging to the patients is, this really isn't that important. And sometimes the patients take that to heart. So next plank, a registry. And again, these darker ones on the bottom, we knew were harder for groups to implement. These ones may take more time, resources, money. Again, back in 2015, unfortunately, registries weren't as common. I think most of the EHRs have now developed many population health tools. So registries are much more ubiquitous. My question would be, how well are they being used? Our groups that use registries found them tremendously helpful. And what they would develop is reports. And they do sort of the things that you saw John Cuddeback do, but they do them on themselves. They'd look at individual physicians and measure their performance over time. They would measure site to site and again, find out who's doing well, go find out what they're doing. My favorite, this is one from Colorado Springs on the right. They would post them in public areas like the bathrooms, and so that the physicians and the staff and everyone would see how they're doing and how they're doing over time. So that often added to quite a bit of let's say, pressure, coercion, whatever word you want to use to stimulate improvement.
Motivation.
Yeah. Motivation, that's a better word. Thank you, Hattie. And then, of course, the best was when you can integrate them into the EHR and really at the point of care, helping the physicians see how they're performing, see which patients may need additional interventions, which ones have not been under control. So making the invisible more visible, and making sure that the interventions are being done. And again, those foreseen functions are being done more and more in electronic health records. 15, I think they were just beginning to come into place and doing point of care reminders and announcements. So again, we found that those could be very, very helpful in helping the providers and helping the patients address hypertension at each visit. The team members, and John, is this you? Help me here. Nope, I still go. Getting the team members trained. And what we're going to do is show you a video. It's a little bit long. It's at 7 minutes. But again, we created this at AMGA because we believe strongly in team-based care. We think that's what will make we think, one, that's what differentiates AMJ members in our groups, and probably all of you here on the tone. This shouldn't just fall all on the physician. It shouldn't just fall all on the care provider. The more people that work and make this a team-based initiative, we think that that's what's going to be successful. So we created this video and we encouraged all of our members to play it. We're going to send you the link on the next slide, but we encouraged all the people just to play it for their teams at maybe a staff meeting, to encourage everyone to realize, yes, this is not just a physician duty, but it's all of us working together.
Research has shown that hypertension is most effectively treated when the patient is a part of a larger care team. Who these team members are and the important roles they play in managing a patient's high blood pressure may come as a surprise.
And mostly when I shoot the basketball, my son and I play every day.
Specialty care providers use their expertise to resolve specific health problems every day. This important work can sometimes overshadow the invaluable role you play in addressing chronic diseases your patients have, including hypertension.
Well, although you came in for a shoulder injury, when we checked your blood pressure earlier, it was kind of high. So I recommend you follow up with your primary care provider next week. In fact, I'm going to send her a note right now.
Many patients see a specialist more often than their primary care provider. This opportunity to intervene in hypertension management by taking accurate blood pressure measurements every visit and referring back to the PCP can mean the difference between a healthy life and a debilitating stroke or heart attack down the line.
Good morning. Nice to see you again, Mr. Smith.
Thanks, just checking in for my 10 a.m. appointment.
Great. I see you were referred by your orthopedist for your blood pressure. I'm sure Dr. Roberts will be glad you came in for this.
Many aspects of a patient's visit, including blood pressure measurement, can be impacted by the welcome he or she receives.
Dr. Roberts is running on time. Have a seat and we'll bring you back shortly.
You're on the front lines in the fight against high blood pressure. Your calm and efficient welcome sets the stage for an accurate blood pressure reading, which can have a tremendous impact on a patient's life.
Hi, Mr. Smith. You can come on back with me. Okay. Hi, Mr. Smith. My name is Danielle, and I'll be taking your blood pressure.
Hi, Danielle. Thanks.
It's important that the patient waits 5 minutes to ensure a more accurate resting blood pressure. It also gives you, as the medical assistant, time to complete documentation and ask questions of the patient.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. So that's 154/92, and I'll be sure to enter that into your record today.
Okay.
As a medical assistant, you may have taken several hundred or even thousands of blood pressure readings. By following the proper steps, your readings are the first step in crucial treatment decisions that impact thousands of patients.
Well, your blood pressure readings are still high today and consistent with what your orthopedist shared. But let's talk about what this means and how we can help you bring your blood pressure under control, okay?
As the trusted primary care provider, the urgency and importance with which you treat hypertension will resonate with patients. That's why it's crucial to immediately address the disease, discuss and mutually decide upon treatment options with the patient, and schedule a follow-up appointment within 30 days.
Thank you. You've answered all of my questions. I'll share this with my wife, and if we have additional questions, we'll call. And I'll get the new prescription and work on eating better.
That's a great plan. Now, you know you can call on me if you have any questions or concerns. Are you still at that pharmacy on Maple Street?
Yes.
So I can send the prescriptions there for pickup?
Yep.
Okay.
Your role as a nurse manager is crucial to blood pressure measurement and control. You set the tone in the office and ensure that blood pressure equipment is working properly, staff are trained in accurate technique, and the entire care team is supporting your providers.
Now we're going to talk about blood pressure. The entire team passed last week's measurement checks with flying colors. Good job, team.
Your efforts to track and communicate team goals has a tremendous impact on the most important bottom line, patients' lives. High-quality care for patients with hypertension is virtually impossible without effectively utilizing your information systems. And you the IT and data specialists ensure these systems run smoothly, are updated regularly, and serve as essential resources for the entire care team to flag and treat patients.
The numbers are improving. Looks like the new EHR alert and visit summaries are working.
Your behind-the-scenes work, creating hypertension registries, EHR updates and alerts, and quality reports, helps the care team manage hypertension in the patient population and avoid long-term complications.
Mr. Smith, how's the family?
Family's good, thanks.
I've got your prescription from Dr. Roberts all ready to go.
Great. Yeah, my blood pressure's been a little high lately, so I'm hoping the medication will help.
Patients visit their pharmacies more frequently than any other health setting. We know your role in hypertension control is much more than just filling prescriptions. You educate patients, improve adherence, reduce adverse effects, and collaborate with other care team members.
Now, since this is a new prescription, I've gone ahead and made sure that it won't interact with any of your other medications. Now tell me, how did Dr. Roberts tell you to take this medication?
Medications are a key component of blood pressure control. Your interaction with Mr. Smith and his care team will help him achieve his blood pressure goals.
So, Michael Jordan, how did your appointment with Dr. Roberts go?
Well, I'm glad you encouraged me to go get my shoulder looked at. Turns out my shoulder will be fine, but I have high blood pressure. Now, Dr. Roberts said that my blood pressure will be under control soon with medication she gave me and some changes I'll have to make.
Arguably, the most important member of the care team is the patient. He or she is the one living with high blood pressure every day and making the changes necessary to control the condition. By including patients in decisions about their own health and providing the resources needed to put these decisions into action, patients with high blood pressure will truly be positioned to live long, healthy lives.
Starting with this.
High blood pressure is a serious disease, but with the support of a dedicated care team, patients have a greater chance of living long and healthy lives.
That's a great video. Thank you.
It is a pretty broad care team. Even the IT people, that makes me feel good. I like that. Anyway, the fact of all specialties intervening with patients not in control, we have a couple of bits of data on that. Just an interesting thing that different organizations may be interested in doing within their, again, their own organization. We've done this across a number of different organizations, sort of averaged things out. But you can see the proportion of patients who are seeing the PCP versus the specialist. Specialists a little more likely not to have recorded the blood pressure during the visit, and then a little bit better control of folks who are winding up getting attributed to a PCP. And then we look by individual specialty. Kind of interesting that the best control is the marriage therapist. You might think it would go in another direction, but there we are. Another claim to effectiveness, I suppose. But at any rate, internal medicine, family medicine, endocrinology, cardiology, you could kind of see the, and one of the things that is a significant cultural issue in a lot of cases, of course, is folks saying, you know, I really don't deal with blood pressure. That's not my thing. And one of the things that's interesting here is to see the impact that getting the specialists involved can make. So Group B had 12% of patients with no blood pressure recorded, largely in specialist visits, and through a lot of work over the period of the entire campaign. This is all groups together. But this is one group that really put an emphasis on specialists, and they were down to 2% missing blood pressures. And then, of course, the proportion in control improved as well. But we love this story from a breast surgeon who had sent a note to the person who was pushing the specialists within her organization to take blood pressures. And the pushing in this case was against the breast surgeon's initial point that I don't have time, my staff doesn't have time, it's not what I do, it's not important. So the system decided to send a nurse to the surgeon's office for an entire week and take blood pressure on every one of her patients. And she said, I saw a patient today with breast cancer who also had blood pressure of 210 over 115 with no symptoms, also no primary care provider. So we called the referral line, an appointment was made with family practice. And I know this is the way it's supposed to work, but she was impressed. The rest of her story is that there were 2 other patients who had stage 2 hypertension that were discovered, no history of hypertension, were discovered during that week of having the nurse take blood pressures. So obviously they adjusted schedules within the surgeon's office, and that was another person who was now on the team as part of caring for blood pressure and detecting blood pressure as well.
So again, this is a thank you to all the participating groups that were part of this campaign. This was our first campaign. We learned a lot, and it was fun, as you could see, kind of figuring out how to motivate and encourage groups to adopt more and more of the planks and to get engaged and involved. The next slide shows even more groups that participated, and so grateful for them. And we learned from each other, and we really are a community of learners. So we're so grateful for that. And I think John's going to now present some of the data about our improvement.
Yeah, here's our results from the end of 2015 as the campaign was coming to a close. And you can see that the average prevalence was 31.6. There's still a good deal of variation because people were choosing their populations a little differently as for the measures that they wanted to send in, but at least people were looking at prevalence, thinking about it, and getting it reported back to them every quarter as part of the reports that we were creating. The campaign team created for the campaign. 70.9%. Almost 71% overall. You can still see there is some variation. There is always some variation. Some groups, as groups, are doing exceedingly well. But if you look at it, the proportion of patients who are not getting their blood pressure measured, except in a few of the groups down here, is really pretty respectable. That's getting a lot better than it was at the beginning of the campaign. And you can see the improvement if you look at each group's change in measurement from the beginning of the campaign to the end of the campaign. Generally improvement. There may be some data issues here and there, but at any rate, those are really very respectable improvement rates. One of the things we learned in Together to Goal was also to look at longitudinal records for individual patients. So that's just something to keep in mind as you look at these measures, because remember, every quarter you're looking at the folks, and the way we set it up, who have had an E&M visit in the last 12 months. And then the next quarter, it's another 12 months, and the next quarter it's another 12 months. So it's not really looking at the same patients necessarily, because different patients, if they come back at least once a year, but remember that you're sort of weighting it based on recency of visits, just by the way the data sort of fall out. So it really makes sense also to look at individual patients, and that's something we really focused on in Together to Goal. We didn't so much on in Measure Up, Pressure Down, but it just something to think about and another way to look at your data that may be valuable. But ultimately, we had more than 500,000 patients with improved detection of high blood pressure or control since the beginning of Measure Up, Pressure Down. So that for our first campaign with 120 some groups across the country, that was quite an achievement that they had come up with. There is, as you know, and I'm sure you're thinking about this as well, but just to point it out, a renewed emphasis on blood pressure with the Surgeon General's call to action. This is from the CDC website. Again, something that you probably are already aware of, but just to mention some great materials available. This is in JAMA. Unfortunately, it is behind their paywall, but for AMA members and people who are subscribing through their libraries or whatever, all number of things. And these were available particularly around the Surgeon General's call to action. One of the questions we've been exploring is how care has been affected by the pandemic. And I think a very encouraging thing is to look at hypertension control during the pandemic. Obviously, there was a big dip in visits and a big dip in any interaction at all right at the beginning of the pandemic in the beginning of late spring, early summer of 2020. But interestingly, if you look at the hypertension control benchmark by 2020 Q4, people were doing really well, and there was a lot of a sense of recovery. We have actually tracked this out month by month, but I think it's really sort of encouraging to see how well people were doing. This happens to be 17 members of our of AMGA who are participating in an ongoing benchmarking and shared learning initiative, not focused particularly on hypertension control, but still hitting 72% overall, 84%, 80%, 78% in some of the organizations. So really very good overall control when you consider the amount of backsliding that occurred. And if you look at the CMS data for 2020, the CMS average was 62.8%, the 80th percentile was 75.5. So we've got pretty good performance. But Jerry wanted us to highlight this one, because I think this is really kind of interesting. This is one group out of these 17 participants. So you can see what was happening quarter to quarter. So if you start at 2019 Q4, 2020 Q1, well, that was kind of okay. And then all of a sudden this pandemic hits, and you can see the, the overall reduction in blood pressure control that occurred in the pandemic. But there was one group who was still focusing on it, made a real effort to catch up by outreach with video visits, and then eventually getting people in to measure their blood pressure. And you can see that they continued to improve quarter by quarter through 2020, starting from this baseline of 2019 Q4 to 2020 Q4. This is that same group. And how are they doing in 2021? You can see overall 17 participants. In 2021, they continued to improve. They sort of got back on the improvement track. And so you can see they're doing better. But this group continued to improve, particularly in Q2 of 2021, but even quarter to quarter, they're continuing improvement. This is the group that I showed you, the site-to-site variation early on, to look at, still, even though they're doing really well, they're over 80%, almost 82% at this one site of care. They have a smaller site of care here that's still at 62%. So big opportunities. It's interesting also that this same group, if you look at the 180 or 140 over 90 threshold, this is how this group was doing at the end of 2021. So 2021 Q4, they used to be group 10. They are now up to group 8 out of this group. They are doing better. You can see they have about 40,000 patients with hypertension. And then here's what happens when you look at the new AHA ACC guidelines. They get to be group 5 because they really are doing a good job focusing on high-risk patients. So you can see what's happening here. We are showing people as fully in control if they're under 130 over 80. If they're not high risk, and high risk means diabetes, CKD, or ASCVD, or else the pooled cohort equation showing a 10-year risk of cardiovascular disease of 10% or more. So those are people who are not high risk, who are over 130 over 80, but less than 140 over 90. So they're in that range. Now, we also have people of unknown risk because we couldn't run the pooled cohort equation on them. We didn't have the data in the EHR. And then we have patients who have one of those 3 comorbidities, diabetes, CKD, or ASCVD, and are between 130 over 80 and 140 over 90. And then here's the group that's out of control under any guideline. And then these are the people who are missing. So at any rate, it's just a way of looking at the population. And you can see this group that's really been focusing on improvement in hypertension has done it in such a way to move up a few notches in the ranking when you look at this more elaborate measure based on AHA and ACC guidelines. So that's what we had to present, and would welcome discussion and questions and
maybe some answers.
Answers, yes, indeed.
I'm sure there's a lot of knowledge in this room, but
yes.
We continue to work with our groups on a number of quality initiatives. As John mentioned, we're working with a new data partner, and our groups are very interested in all sorts of measures, including risk factors for ASCVD. So we are working diligently with all of our members, and many of them continue the lessons from this campaign. So with that, I'm open, and John and I are open to questions and maybe answers.
Jerry and John, that was a fantastic presentation, and the amount of data is incredible, and the effort that you put into that was tremendous. We have a lot of questions that are piling up. One of the interesting things that I saw was the fact that after these efforts, the improvement was a fairly modest 2.8% over 2 years in improvement with all this effort and work. If we want to jump another 10%, how would you suggest we go beyond where you've gone to, let's say, try to get to 80%? This was your goal and our goal to do that. As we look forward, we're trying to incorporate going from volume to value. Does that allow us to incorporate this in? Does that offer a possibility? We're talking about perhaps having pharmacists not just educate patients, but perhaps prescribe and monitor them. When I think about having somebody come back in a month in a busy schedule, that's not always possible. But if we involve pharmacists and other community health workers and others, can we do that? And then the last is, do we look forward, as we are in many situations, of converting to home blood pressure measurements and maybe more telemedicine with some of these people as a way of perhaps controlling costs and increasing the ability to see them within that 30 days, which is really tough for a lot of our healthcare systems.
That was a lot of questions. Do I get to pick which one I want to answer? It's great. It's great. And I think your question is exactly right. 2.8 is modest. It was our first campaign. I'm not making excuses, but we learned a lot. And I think we applied it to our second campaign and now our third campaign. I'll start with some generic things. We took anyone who wanted to participate in the first one, which is what we do because we're a trade association, and we can see some were more engaged than others, some lost interest over time, some had other priorities. So I would say one of the lessons learned is it has to start at the top. There has to be a commitment, probably from C-level people, that this is important, that we're going to stick with it, and we're going to make it work. So one group that I'll mention by name, Henry Ford, during the campaign, interesting enough, did not make a lot of progress. They called me 2 years after the campaign ended, and I actually went up there for a visit. Now, Henry Ford has a very diverse population and a lot of challenges there, but they stuck with it and they made it a system priority. They had a whole bunch of other efforts to make sure that this was addressed. And they called me when they hit 80%, and they invited me up there. So, and this came from the top. So that would be one lesson learned is, you can't take people where they don't want to go. And there's got to be the interest, the resources, and the leadership from the top. John, any other thoughts on how we get better results next time?
I think Bill's idea of incorporating home blood pressure measures is important, and doing outreach via telehealth or video visits or whatever, I think is because the technology for that is getting better all the time. One other thing, and this is where it would be helpful, we need the help of actual hypertension experts, which Jerry and I don't claim to be, but I think one thing that we didn't focus a lot of attention on during Measure Up Pressure Down was so-called treatment-resistant or refractory hypertension. I think this is a particularly complex component of the population. We heard from a number of folks that they thought it was about 10% of the total population. And when you consider you're trying to get to 80%, it's half of your opportunity. So I think the question, we know there are some new medications, another new class of medication, endothelin receptor antagonists, that are certainly in the pipeline. Again, not being an expert in hypertension, we don't know too much about what their clinical role will be. We do have a couple of our members who are making a real effort to optimize blood pressure management and medications based on measuring systemic vascular resistance. Vascular impedance measurement, that's another strategy. So I think I'm not suggesting that this is the only way to get there, but I think there are, as you get closer and closer to to this number that gets harder to reach, those may be a couple of strategies that to look at the treatment resistant component of the population, focus on medication adherence, as Jerry pointed out. That's a real opportunity even for the center bulk of the population, I think, but then these two subpopulations particularly.
That's great. We had a couple questions. One, Nathan, if you're still on, was related to what we used to use, which was fixed dose combination therapy, which we used 50 years ago and then sort of disappeared. It is one of the principles in the AMA program for blood pressure, fixed dose. But when we looked at our patients across the board, I would say 90% of our clinicians do not use fixed dose. Do you see that as a way into the future for blood pressure control? It's been used in third world countries effectively, but not really accepted in the US as well.
Yeah, we did hear though early on from Mark Jaffe that one of the benefits that they saw in starting with that combination of the thiazide and lisinopril is that you can tell the patient to take half a pill a day or 1 pill a day or 2 pills a day. You already have them on two medications at that point. So if you think about just the logistics of getting 2 pills, taking 2 pills, that sort of thing, I think that was what encouraged the Kaiser Permanente Northern California team to use that approach, and at least to get started with the fixed dose combination, if not go any further. And obviously people who may become pregnant, you want to have maybe chlorthalidone instead of hydrochlorothiazide or whatever. But at any rate, that was their rationale, was just logistics of starting the medication.
Yeah, and kind of as a follow-up to this great response, is it your most clinicians that if your dosages of 2 medicines are tolerated, many times with better efficacy, and the other part to this,
I'm afraid I'm hearing the audio drop out, and I don't know if it's
I'm sorry. Yeah, the other part of my question related to this is whether who are 20 or 10 above target as recommended by the guidelines are recommended for, not necessarily a fixed dose combination, but perhaps two medicines, because as we know, many people need 2 or 3 to get well controlled.
Yeah. I think I got most of that, John. I think it was like with those patients that have, more elevated blood pressure, like 10 to 20 points above, how to manage those. And again, we're not hypertension experts, but I think maybe Michael Cantor has more data from Kaiser. I think what Mark Jaffe found is that many patients, I think it was like 80 or 90%, required 2 or more medicines to get under control. So why start with 1 when you know that's not going to be successful? Mike, did I get that right?
No, you basically got it right. And you have this other issue of therapeutic inertia, where people will start on 1 with all good intent, and somehow it never gets to the second medication.
Yeah.
So Jerry, are you seeing the hands up? I think Scott's
I
hand
am.
is up first.
Scott?
Okay.
Scott, nice to see you, guy. You're on mute.
Scott, you're on mute.
Well, I don't know how to unmute him. So meanwhile,
looks like that might be a little telephone icon. So maybe, Scott, are you calling in by phone? I don't know. I'm just trying. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I don't know how to do. Does anyone know? I'm not
I
a
don't
Zoom
know.
expert. I'm not a hypertension or a Zoom expert. So but I don't know how to do it. Do you want to type it in, Scott, or is it too long?
Type it in, Scott.
Also, sometimes it's *6 to unmute.
Yeah.
*6.
we're still seeing your mute button, so perhaps we should go.
Oh, there he goes. I think he got it.
Oh, he's on.
*6. Susan, I am not worthy.
Hooray.
Hey, this is
Did you also
collaboration.
have the winning lotto numbers? Yes. Yeah, I had a comment and then two questions. One's pretty quick. Interesting, you know, the med resistance issue, when we're going around talking to folks about this, we always call that sort of the graduate school problem. As you alluded to, that's a tiny percent, and most of these groups are at 50 or 60% control. You got a lot of other work to do before you start worrying about that little 5%. You should think about that 5% and who you might have as your subject matter experts that are going to be the ones you might refer to, but it's really a small portion of the work you have to do. That's the comment. Jerry, you mentioned leadership has to have it as a priority. I don't recall, was that actually on your planks?
No, we had a, and again, we learned that with Together to Goal and even our next campaign. With our collaboratives, one of the things we learned is if we brought people together and there wasn't leadership involvement, many of the collaborative groups kind of fell off. Even within a course of a year, they kind of fell off and weren't participating. So with our collaboratives, we started having the CEO sign off that they're going to participate in a little, and we actually started developing, feels like a little bit more legalistic, but MOUs, that this is sort of the commitment that's required. And we're beginning to integrate those now into the campaign. So we're trying to make it structurally that leadership knows that these are the commitments that they're making.
Great, and we found that to be true too. And actually we have it on our Blue Shield thing that we do when we go around to groups to try to get them to do the basic work for best practices for improving hypertension. And that leads to the follow-on question for that, of course, is, so based on what you've learned, would you modify the way you have the planks listed as these are the must-haves and these are the sort of, we call them the value-based. Now that you've had some time to reflect on that, would you perhaps add the leadership one in, or is there other things you might think about rearranging or changing?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer, but I'm going to think about it. But the, you know, I think what we've learned, here's another thing we learned, Scott, is getting the right contacts at the group. So one of the issues has always been data and collecting data, and John Cuddeback can talk about it. We have good data from our groups that we have their data. The other groups, let's just say some is great and some is a bit more squirrely, and we had to spend some time working with those groups and saying, okay, we don't believe your data, and helping their IT people run it correctly. So we've now learned when people sign up for the campaign, the onboarding process, it's real important to start collecting names. And for example, there may be a champion at the group who is very involved, but that person may move on. And if you don't have a backup name, you're kind of now trying to scramble to find out who you're going to contact at that group. So collecting names was real important. Really understanding where they're going to begin and what they're going to do. But just an example, and having an IT contact was critical. And we learned that through this campaign because we didn't have them.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Jerry. One of the other planks that we actually have in ours is clear, actionable, timely data. And that's kind of covered there in the registry, but it's a little different, as you know. So I'm glad to hear that. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear what you think about as you think about
I'd be curious, can I throw it back at you, Scott? Can I throw it back at you? Yeah. What have you found? I mean, this is 7 years old. What have you found maybe that has been helpful for the groups that you work with that maybe that is missing from here?
Those were the two that stuck out to me.
Thank you.
The clear, accurate, actionable data. Because I know the first time I did this with my group, when I had to get the leadership involved. So I actually got the board involved and said, I'm going to show unblinded hypertension data. And you have to be prepared that I'm going to take some hits, but I want you to know it's good data, first of all. But second of all, you got to say, okay, and you're going to take some heat. And they said, well, why is that? I said, well, because one of the board members, and they all looked around at each other, doesn't have very good scores. And one of them is also a founding member of the group, and they all look around at each other. And they're conjecturing who it was. They said, well, who is it? I said, well, I'm not going to tell until we get to there, if you're good with that. So I kind of pressure tested it. And they said they were okay with it when we showed it at the group or at the meeting. It was interesting. The first thing the person did was the data's wrong. So I actually showed every one of their hypertensive patients. And they said, well, number 4 is not my patient. You know, he's standing there squinting at it. And I said, well, what about the other 136? So it's at 136. And then there was silence in the room, and then everyone's like, oh, this guy's serious. So that's the kind of thing. That's also why medical directors only last 3 years. But anyhow, I think that was the other key one, is having the clear, actionable, timely data that is accurate. It has to be pinpoint accurate, or you're going to lose them right away.
I see Jim Duddle has a question.
Yeah,
Don't
then
ask an easy one, Jim.
I'll make this fairly brief, and I hope, Jerry, for you and John. I'm wondering whether any of the groups used a community health worker, both for holding people accountable for doing their blood pressure, for getting it back to them, and then for them sending it to a pharmacist or primary care doctor, and also for the communication. Because the expensive parts, it turns out there were 2 good New England Journal articles on big programs, one in Southeast Asia, one in Argentina, where they use community health workers for like $10 a year. And they were able to maintain and improve control. And after 3 years, and every place else tends to fall off. So I'm just wondering if we are not missing the boat by trying to use the most expensive people, MDs and pharmacists, when we aren't using the least expensive, who may be adequate.
Well, fantastic point. And I will tell you, I think, Jim, what I'm hearing from the groups, I haven't heard any groups that are using community health workers in that way, but what I am hearing from groups is there is a severe labor shortage at all levels, from physicians to nurses to MAs. And I think everyone is reevaluating who does what and what we can use from, let's say, less skilled, but perhaps valuable members of the team. So that's what I'm hearing, Jim. So I think your timing actually is perfect to bring up new care team models.
And the 2 stories that I remember, particularly from Measure Up, Pressure Down, were from Sacramento Family Health Centers, where community health workers were engaged and so successful with the population because they were trusted by the patients, and that just was a critical component. Another one was Baylor in Dallas, the Baylor Health System in Dallas. Both of them, as we were kind of debriefing at the end of Measure Up, Pressure Down, both of them brought up the importance of community health workers in the improvements they'd achieved.
Thank you. I think we should pursue that. Go ahead.
I think Dawn has your hand up. And you're still on mute too.
Yeah. As COVID's rather rudely shoved us into new care models, I was wondering if you've seen any particularly effective telemedicine solutions to hypertension.
John, you probably have your fingers on telemedicine. We're learning a lot, and we're studying the data as quickly as we can to understand what we're looking backwards, what happened, but also trying to figure out what's happening with telemedicine.
Yeah, I figured it might be a little early to have much data, but I thought you might have some anecdotal ideas from some groups here and there of what they're doing.
And I do want to comment, there was a question about the role of the pharmacist. Another hat I wear, I serve on the board of directors for the Pharmacy Quality Alliance. And that tells you how pro-pharmacist I am. I think that it is a tremendously underutilized member of the care team that is skilled, that sees the patient regularly, that is trusted. At AMJ, we are not territorial. We believe in the expanded care team, each working to the maximum of their licensed ability. I think that COVID has taught us that the pharmacist's role is greater than we have had it in the past. And I look forward to pharmacists further managing and their care teams further working with our medical groups to manage blood pressure and other conditions as well. Looks like Mike and then Susan. These are great, lots of questions.
Yeah, this has been a really interesting session, and I've been enjoying it a lot. So wanted to thank you. I just wanted to make a couple comments and before I ask my question, but I think the leadership element is key, and I've just bumped into this over and over in multiple quality initiatives, some related to cardiovascular disease, others not. And without that, I think things just move a lot slower. And I think the big pharma has figured out how to sell drugs that may add little value, in part by how they engage leaders in certain areas. And there's some learning from them that could be used to a good way. I wanted to talk about seasonality. I was very intrigued with it because it's something we've seen. And my question to you is, when one is early on in the journey and there's a lot of room to improve, maybe you can kind of ignore seasonality if you've got a 30% gap. And but when you start to get closer to the goal line, that seasonality is actually a sizable factor. How do you manage giving people monthly data and it starts to go up and they say, oh, we're doing better, and you have to say, no, not really, because it's a seasonality. Is there a better way to manage the sort of, from a data performance improvement point of view, the seasonality issue? And if you've got any theories on why we see it, I'd love to hear that.
I don't think you would see it in California because the weather's always perfect. So
Yeah,
I don't.
but we do.
And in fact, we looked at Florida versus Minnesota in our data, and it turned out seasonality exists in both. What we actually did in the campaign, and we did a couple of short interventions alongside the campaign, innovator tracks. And when we're doing things over 6 months, then that becomes a huge issue. So we actually used seasonally adjusted data, and we came up with monthly, since we had 3 years of history spanning lots of different members in different geographic areas and all of that. We came up with adjustment factors, little additive adjustment factors like those residuals you saw in the plot, and that's what we used for the reporting. We didn't do that for the campaign overall because the campaign ended at the same season its baseline began, but we did do that for the innovator tracks.
Are you able to share the mathematical methodology for that?
Mm-hmm. It's very simple, but we're happy to share. Yeah,
I appreciate it. One last comment. I noticed, unless I missed something, I did not see any data on hypertension control based on race, ethnicity. And do you feel there's an opportunity there?
Well, Jerry's slide at the beginning shows you that there's an enormous opportunity, I think.
I mean, that was a miss. That was a miss.
Is that something that, going forward, should we all be looking at it? Okay.
Yeah. And so we built that into, we built that into our latest campaign. Definitely a miss, and looking back, what's interesting, Mike, is looking backwards, we were starting from ground zero and we were just trying to get it off the ground, and that added a layer of complexity that we weren't just ready for. But I think we're now more mature and ready to tackle that head on, and probably should have earlier.
No, I mean, I'm not sure you should have earlier because, we went through the same journey. We didn't look at it 10, 15 years ago. And when we started to, it creates a whole nother set of complexity and data integrity issues and other things. So I think, I hate to say this, but I think one has to sort of have the right infrastructure in place to tackle it on. So as long as I wasn't trying to be critical, I just think it's an important area that we should acknowledge.
Yes, and we've made health equity a strategic action item in our AMG strategic plan that we just revisited last year. Definitely, it's getting a lot more attention that it now deserves. Other questions? I saw Dr. Ivy's comments, and if people are dropping off, maybe we need to go, but she talked about training undergraduate students as health coaches to work with people with high blood pressure. Can be trained with motivational interviewing, lifestyle changes. Wonderful. I think, some of this is blood pressure, and with the community health workers, some of it is just all those social determinants of health and helping patients with transportation and helping patients with, when I hired care managers first at Sharp, the number one issue that the care managers worked, and these were patients with multiple chronic conditions, was they just couldn't afford their medicine. That was the biggest issue that they had to deal with. So if they can't afford it, they're not going to get their blood pressure or diabetes under control. I saw another question regarding, no, maybe I missed it, pharmacist.
Annie Tsai, I'm pretty sure she's with Sutter, is asking whether you might consider doing a reboot of Measure Up, Pressure Down, that a lot of people don't know the planks could still use the improvement.
Yeah.
I wanted to raise the issue of something that you'll remember so clearly, Dr. Hood in San Diego from Multicultural Health, bringing up the complexity of treating African-American patients and his practice in particular. And there's been this controversy about the different guidelines. I wonder if that's something that AMGA has taken on, where I know Kaiser had a couple different protocols that they were considering, and we have not found the right speaker on that topic.
It's a great question. I see Annie C's. Be glad to talk with you offline. Definitely, we're looking at opportunities with health equity, and I think hypertension and coronary artery disease is definitely one of those. The answer is don't know, Patty. It's always the best part about quality improvement is like there's no shortage of welcoming targets. There's so much to improve. So I used to say at Sharp, it's job security. There is just so many things that we can improve in healthcare, but it's fun, at least to have things like you're doing at University of Best Practice, keep moving the ball forward. So congratulations to you all, Dr. Bonner and the entire team, just fighting the good fight.
Jerry, did any of your efforts focus on family members or caregivers, i.e. the person who's there 24 hours a day or almost at home saying, did you take your medicine? Did you do it? In the movie you had, you showed that he then the patient discussed it with his wife who was there, et cetera, and sort of reinforcing. Did any of your efforts say focus on the healthcare individual who was associated at home or a family member?
And that doesn't ring a bell, but boy, that's a great idea.
It is
It's a
really
great
important.
idea. It's so important. We worked, when I was back at Sharp, one of the things we worked on, which is kind of a step backwards, we just worked on this whole communication issue and really working with our physicians on good communication. We learned through our data that many physicians just on the medications don't even mention the name of the medication, how often to take it, what are the potential side effects, why they should take it. It's all like skipped over. So we had to begin on some of the basic communication skills with physicians to, but so what I'm thinking is like involving the family, et cetera. It's like, should all be part of that.
I have one more anecdote.
Please.
And your anecdote made me think of it, which is the last time I went in for a healthcare visit, I was at a very fancy institution and I was in a specialty clinic. This is during the pandemic. Of course, you wouldn't go in unless you absolutely had to, right? So they put a cuff on me and it squeezed my arm so much, I almost screamed. And it made my blood pressure go up, of course, because it hurt so much. Have you heard this story from others? And what do we do to, the woman, I said, please take that off me. You're really hurting me. And she said, oh, we hear that all the time. And I thought, Okay, I'm not going to take this on. It's not my battle today. But how ridiculous.
Interesting. Yes, yes. We, again, getting that blood pressure taken correctly and calming the patient down and explaining things is just, it's critical. It is critical.
Well,
Well,
you're
thank
so
you,
kind.
everybody.
We
You're
do
so kind
know
to
from
spend all this
animal
time with us. Go
we
ahead,
do know from our animal experiments that if you induce pain, blood pressure goes up, no question about it. So I do think that it has to be reasonable. I noticed in your movie you had auscultatory blood pressure, and I think a lot of our systems, healthcare providers now sort of converted over to the oscillometric, measurement. And as you said, that helped with eliminating the zero numbers on some of your blood pressures. So I think it's an easier way to do it. It's a little bit more measured and the patient's a little bit more relaxed for it, as long as the cuff is appropriately sized and put on right. So hopefully hypertension pain or with measurement is not contributing to this, and that's why we sometimes repeat it and see it lower than second time around. But you may want to look at your programmed cuffs to make sure they don't go too high if they miss a blood pressure, because it can be painful in that particular situation for it. So those are all nuances or tools in your toolkit to provide. And I think your training video was very good in showing healthcare personnel how we need to do it appropriately in a reasonable way. Yes, you can measure it inappropriately and mess up everything. So that's an interesting thing. The two of you have presented an outstanding program today. I mean, there's so much information in there and so much data, and it is very helpful for you to show that to us, because we're all struggling with hypertension control. And I guarantee we'll still be struggling with it next year as well, after hopefully the pandemic settles down a little. But the reality is we need to keep doing this. I was interested that your campaign, you felt, is a 5-year program. But yet hypertension is going to be lifelong for all of us. So we have to come up with what I would call sustainability, programs that are there. Is there any way that you can suggest how to go to the next way or next step after you finish your 5-year program? Do we have to reinvent and come up with a new program every 5 years? Or are there some ways of perhaps having a lingering benefit from some of these programs?
John, want to try that one? That's a good question. I think there's two issues that I see with sustainability. Number one, we like to make sure what other interventions they've done stick, so that they don't end the campaign and just go back to normal, that they have to structurally, embed them in the organizations. And again, what we found is those organizations that kind of took the, if you will, the seed of measure up, pressure down, often continued even long after the campaign ended. And then my only other plug is I think some of this has to be external. Some of it has to be health plan, CMS, CMMI. It has to be mandated, that there has to be accountability for outcomes.
I was just going to make one final comment, if I may. We didn't talk too much about lifestyle management and how can we better leverage, these EMR systems, as well as mobile health types of efforts to get patients as well as our healthcare providers to better implement evidence-based proven lifestyle strategies, such as the DASH diet is in the guidelines, and There are other recommendations, including maintenance of ideal body weight, reducing excessive alcohol intake. All these can contribute dramatically to improving blood pressure control. And we need to better utilize, for example, the dietitian community, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics that few people ever talk about. And they can play a big role if they're better integrated into our healthcare system, as an example.
And of course, exercise, right? I notice a 24-hour benefit every time I swim. It's the greatest blood pressure control.
So John, do you want to talk about your work with DPPP and trying to nudge primary care providers to refer and treat patients for DPPP?
Yeah, we've been working with Tufts University, which has created a predictive model for people with prediabetes and trying to risk stratify that large population, which is about a third of American adults, and allow provider organizations to focus on the folks who are at highest risk. But the consistently most effective thing is the diabetes prevention program. You know, that lifestyle program, landmark clinical trial, late 90s, published in 2002. Stopped early because it was so effective. It's a 58% relative risk reduction of developing diabetes in 3 years. And so a lot of our member organizations were actually setting up their own diabetes prevention program, national NDPP certified. Used to be done largely by the YMCAs. But organizations were doing that themselves. Then the pandemic hit. So there's a lot of interest in some online programs like that. There's obviously, as you point out, many different ways of incorporating online programs, encouragement, whatever, with lifestyle modification. So I think that's certainly an important area and one that we'll see a lot of growth in.
And I think the same concept can be used for even preventing hypertension.
Of course.
We're talking about treating it mainly, but starts trying to prevent it from developing at, early in the course of, a person's lifetime.
Right. Very good.
I'm wondering, Jerry, a couple of public policy questions. Your dear colleague Parag Agnihotri, who had been my co-chair in Sacramento until you recruited him to come down to San Diego to take over for you at Sharp. Now he's at UCSD and he's been participating with us for a long time. He suggested we get away from our biometric only approach that we're measuring groups for in California and start measuring health systems for actual event rates, heart attacks, strokes, evolution of heart failure. Would love your help with that. That's a complex idea, but it seems very worthy.
Interesting, fascinating. Yeah, I'm going to defer to John, who's more my measurement guru than I am. But yeah, it's tricky, and the measurement piece, as you saw, is challenging, even with what we've got. But there's I think there's a lot of opportunity to, measurement's a challenge. I'll just stop there. Many of our groups are reporting 400 or 500 measures. If you start looking at the inpatient and outpatient measures that they're now required to measure, I'm not sure how many are valuable, and perhaps they need to narrow down to the ones that are really meaningful.
Well, I think when we were preparing for this, I showed you the Centers for Disease Control Wonder data that shows the very disproportionate impact of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and neurovascular disease on early deaths. So I would just love to collaborate on reducing the number of measures, focusing on the law of large numbers. Let's focus on what's really important, what's really killing people, and think of new ways to do that rather than just inundating the groups with an unbearable load of measures that don't result in actual large number of deaths. So
the one encouraging thing about that, I think, is that over the past few years, we've come to recognize that we are beginning to see the benefits of prevention earlier than we used to think we would see the benefits of prevention. So I think that's another reason that is worthy of study. I think you're exactly right.
You know, as we try to reduce the measures that are burdensome to all of us, we do have to remember that hypertension, control of hypertension, is the one measure that we can control to give us the greatest reduction in cardiovascular mortality. That is a tenet of Million Hearts, and it's clearly the low hanging fruit. Perhaps the easiest way to reduce mortality is control of blood pressure. So I think continuing to monitor blood pressure and the numbers you showed today is a very valuable asset for improving overall healthcare.
And I always like to show this slide and how hypertension, elevated blood pressure, is the leading cause of death globally. And a lot of people don't realize it, right? 700,000 or so deaths in the world every year are due to elevated blood pressure, more than any other cause, even accidents, even hyperglycemia, high cholesterol, cigarette smoking. Hypertension is the leading cause. I'll just make one more comment that I do think, though, that we really need to think about multiple risk factor control. And for example, in people with diabetes, they don't realize that it's a cardiovascular condition, and it's actually control of LDL cholesterol that's going to have a bigger impact on their prognosis than control of blood sugar, although everything's important. Data that we publish show control of three main things: LDL, blood pressure, and A1C. Well, is related to 60% lower cardiovascular risk. So we need to get people thinking in terms of composite risk factor control, because when you just focus on one thing, sometimes other things are left out. So I think that's some very important point to make.
I just want to thank Jerry for getting us on the path of measuring at the community level what's going on with blood pressure. And this is pretty small on my screen. Dr. Balmer, do you want to talk about it a little bit? I want to also congratulate Dr. Balmer on the amazing dent he put into blood pressure control in the capital region.
Well, as Hattie says, as the founder of Right Care, what she did was she started the ball rolling on this. And what we are able to do is collect at least data from different counties: Sacramento County, LA County, San Diego County, and Santa Clara, which is the most recent addition. And we see a disparity in the control of blood pressure across all of those. But what we've been able to achieve is an increase in control of blood pressure, as we said earlier, both in individuals with hypertension, and then on the bottom is for people with diabetes, where it's also considerably important. And we display this information. Unfortunately, because the data we get, we're about a year behind at all times, and we're trying to look at actually getting it more current, because one of the things we'd like to have is literally monthly data, because that's much more effective for clinicians to sit there and say, okay, 2 years ago there was a problem, et cetera. They said, well, maybe I wasn't there, or that was something else. So we're trying to improve that. But it is a way of, in fact, getting a little bit of healthy competition, where we can say, we all want to have better healthcare, and this is better for all of our patients if we can improve this. And we're all struggling to try to get to the 80% goal that we achieved before. It does allow us to focus on either high performers, which I agree with was discussed today. If we can find the groups that are doing very well with the same group of patients, we can learn from them, as well as identifying the low performers where we can provide additional guidance in that situation. So it's been important. There's been a steady improvement, not as great as we would love to see, but we're following with that. And today's program is an additional step forward for us in educating our individuals and trying to overcome that. So we certainly want to thank our speakers today, Jerry and John, for giving us an excellent presentation, to all our participants and our panels for it. And we want to look forward to the next group where you can see we're taking one step from today, and we're trying to add a pharmacist to the healthcare team, which we think is a valuable asset for our healthcare providers, and can fill that gap of trying to get the patients back within 30 days. And clearly pharmacists are trained well enough to handle that. We don't have enough pharmacists available, but we're looking for other healthcare team professionals to assist in getting that very important less than 30-day visit for those people with high blood pressure. So we're tremendously thankful for our speakers today and the program. We hope it's a great step forward. And before we sign off, I want everyone to make a commitment based on Nathan's comments to go out and exercise after sitting here to achieve or get closer to Nathan's lifestyle recommendations, which all of us could use, I'm sure. So thank you very much, everyone, for the program and your participation today.
Thank you.
How wonderful to have you with us. Thank you. It's delightful to reconvene on Zoom and not have to fly to DC. Really appreciate all your hard work. Amazing what you've started, Jerry.
Excellent. Thank you all. Have a great rest of the day.
Enjoy your exercise. I'm off.
Yeah.